The wind howled through the mountain pass like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of death. Joyce Clark pressed herself against the rocky outcropping, her threadbare shawl whipping around her trembling frame as the first fat snowflakes began to fall. Her legs, already weakened by weeks of poor food and endless walking, threatened to buckle beneath her. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon all morning was finally upon her, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her more than the bitter air that she would not survive it alone. She had been walking for 3 days since leaving the last settlement, following what the innkeeper had assured her was a well-traveled path to the next town. But the path had grown fainter with each mile, and now, as the snow began to fall in earnest, she could barely make out any trace of it at all. Her worn boots, already splitting at the seams, offered little protection against the sharp stones that jutted up through the thin soil. Each step sent jolts of pain through her feet and upper legs, but she had pushed forward anyway, driven by desperation and the knowledge that stopping meant certain death. The storm struck with a ferocity that took her breath away. One moment, she had been picking her way carefully along what she hoped was still the path, and the next she was engulfed in a whirling wall of white that erased the world around her. The wind drove the snow horizontally, stinging her face and hands with tiny needles of ice. She stumbled forward blindly, her hands outstretched, searching for anything that might offer shelter or guidance. That was when her strength finally gave out. Her legs, pushed beyond their limits, simply refused to carry her any further. She collapsed to her knees in the deepening snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps that formed small clouds in the frigid air. The cold seeped through her thin dress and worn cloak, settling into her bones with a terrible finality. She tried to rise, but her body would not obey. The weakness that had been building for weeks, the result of too little food and too much hardship, had finally claimed her. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Joyce closed her eyes against the driving snow and tried to think of something other than the cold that was slowly claiming her. She thought of her sister Victoria, safe and warm in her fine house in Philadelphia, probably sitting by a crackling fire at this very moment, completely unaware that Joyce was dying alone on a mountain pass hundreds of miles away. The irony was not lost on her that she had been trying to reach Victoria when this storm caught her, carrying with her the letter that had arrived just a month ago, begging Joyce to come home. The letter had been full of apologies and regrets, Victoria's elegant handwriting flowing across the expensive paper as she explained how sorry she was for the things that had been said, for the way Joyce had been cast out of the family, for her choice to marry beneath her station. Peter Scott had been a good man, Victoria wrote, and she had been wrong to judge him so harshly simply because he worked with his hands instead of inheriting his wealth. The consumption that had taken him the previous winter had also taken away Victoria's anger, replacing it with the understanding that life was too short for such foolish pride. But the letter had come too late. By the time it reached Joyce in the small mining town where she and Peter had tried to build a life together, he was already 6 months in the ground, and she was facing eviction from their tiny cabin for lack of rent money. The mine had closed shortly after Peter's death, taking with it any hope she might have had of supporting herself in that harsh place. She had sold everything of value they had owned, which amounted to precious little, and used the money to begin the long journey east toward Philadelphia and the promise of reconciliation with the only family she had left. Now, as the snow piled up around her and the cold crept deeper into her bones, she wondered if Victoria would ever know what had happened to her. Would anyone even find her body, or would she simply disappear into the wilderness, another casualty of the unforgiving frontier? The thought filled her with a sadness that was almost worse than the physical pain of freezing. She was so lost in her dark thoughts that she almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. At first, she thought it might be her imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on her ears. But then she heard it again, the steady crunch of boots on snow, growing closer despite the howling of the storm. She opened her eyes and tried to peer through the swirling white, but she could see nothing beyond a few feet in any direction. A shadow materialized out of the storm, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a steady confidence that spoke of familiarity with these treacherous mountains. Joyce's heart leaped with hope, but then fear quickly followed. She was alone and helpless, and she knew nothing about this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. In her weakened state, she would be completely at his mercy, whatever his intentions might be. The figure drew closer, and she could make out more details. It was indeed a man, wrapped in a heavy coat and wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shed the snow like a roof. His face was mostly hidden by a thick beard and the shadows cast by his hat, but she could see his eyes, dark and serious as they took in her condition. He stopped a few feet away from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other through the falling snow. Checkpoint. Alexander Richardson had been tracking the storm for the better part of the morning, reading the signs in the clouds and the behavior of the wildlife, with the skill of a man who had spent most of his adult life in these mountains. He had known it would be a bad one, the kind that could bury a man alive if he was caught in the open, and he had been hurrying to reach his cabin when he spotted the dark shape huddled against the rocks. At first he had thought it might be an injured animal, perhaps a deer that had been caught by an early hunter and had crawled away to die. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made his blood run cold. It was a woman, and from the way she was hunched over in the snow, she was in serious trouble. Alexander was not a man given to quick decisions when it came to other people. His years of solitude in the mountains had taught him to be cautious, to think twice before getting involved in the affairs of others. Too often, he had learned, such involvement led to nothing but trouble. But one look at the woman's condition told him that caution was a luxury neither of them could afford. She was clearly exhausted and probably half frozen already. If he left her here, she would be dead within the hour. He approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her any more than she already was. She looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror, and he could see that she was trying to assess whether he represented salvation or a different kind of danger. He could hardly blame her for the wariness. A woman alone on the frontier learned quickly that not all men could be trusted, and his appearance, he knew, was not particularly reassuring. Alexander was a large man, made larger by the heavy coat and the layers of clothing necessary for mountain living. His beard was thick and unkempt, and his hair hung past his shoulders, giving him the look of someone who had little concern for the niceties of civilized society. His hands, visible even through his heavy gloves, were scarred from years of hard work, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who spent his life outdoors. He could see how he might appear threatening to a woman in her vulnerable position, but there was no time for gentle reassurances or careful introductions. The storm was worsening by the minute, and they needed to get to shelter immediately. He knelt down in the snow beside her, noting the way she flinched slightly at his proximity but did not try to move away. She was too weak, he realized, to run even if she wanted to. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. It had been weeks since he had spoken to another human being, and the words felt strange in his throat. She tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering so violently that she could barely form words. She attempted to rise, pushing herself up with her hands, but her legs would not support her weight. She collapsed back into the snow with a soft cry of frustration and despair. Alexander studied her face, noting the pallor of her skin and the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and hunger. She was clearly at the end of her strength, pushed far beyond what her body could endure. The storm would kill her for certain if she stayed here, but he was not sure she could survive the journey to his cabin, even with help. "I have a place," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction he had been traveling. "Not far. But we need to go now." She nodded, understanding the urgency even if she could not speak. She tried again to stand, and this time he helped her, taking her arm and pulling her gently to her feet. But the moment he released her, her legs buckled again, and she would have fallen if he had not caught her. It was clear that she could not walk, not in her current condition, and certainly not through the deepening snow and howling wind. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, weighing his options. He could try to help her walk, supporting her weight as they made their way slowly through the storm. But that would take too long, and they would both likely freeze before they reached shelter. Or he could leave her here and go for help, but by the time he returned, it would be too late. There was only one choice that made sense, though it was one that would require him to trust this stranger completely, just as she would have to trust him. Without a word, he bent down and scooped her up in his arms, lifting her as easily as if she weighed no more than a child. She was so light that it alarmed him. He could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress, and her arms, when she instinctively wrapped them around his neck for support, felt fragile as bird bones. She stiffened in his arms at first, her body rigid with fear and uncertainty. He could feel her heart racing against his chest, and he knew that she was terrified of what might happen to her now that she was completely helpless in the hands of a stranger. But as the wind howled around them and the snow continued to fall, she seemed to realize that she had no choice but to trust him. Her body gradually relaxed, and she allowed her head to rest against his shoulder. Alexander began to walk, his long strides carrying them through the snow with a steady rhythm. The storm made navigation difficult, but he knew these mountains like other men knew the rooms of their own houses. Even in the whiteout conditions, he could sense the subtle changes in the terrain that told him he was still on the right path. The woman in his arms said nothing, but he could feel her shivering against him, and he quickened his pace as much as he dared. The journey that would normally take him 20 minutes stretched to nearly an hour as he fought against the wind and the deepening snow. Several times he had to stop and get his bearings, using the shape of a rock outcropping or the angle of a slope to confirm his location. The woman grew heavier in his arms as exhaustion and cold sapped what little strength she had left, but she never complained or asked him to put her down. Checkpoint 2. When Alexander's cabin finally came into view through the swirling snow, Joyce felt a surge of relief so intense that it brought tears to her eyes. The structure was larger than she had expected, built of thick logs that looked like they could withstand anything the mountains might throw at them. Smoke was rising from the chimney, dispersing quickly in the wind, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows. It looked like the most welcoming sight she had ever seen. Alexander carried her up the steps to the covered porch and kicked the door open with his boot. The warmth that greeted them was like a physical embrace, and Joyce felt her frozen muscles begin to relax for the first time in hours. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and rough-hewn furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. Everything was scrupulously clean and well-organized, speaking to the careful habits of a man who lived alone and took pride in his surroundings. He carried her to a chair near the fireplace and set her down gently, then immediately began building up the fire. Joyce watched him work, noting the efficient way he moved and the obvious familiarity with which he handled the logs and kindling. Within minutes, the fire was blazing merrily, throwing dancing shadows on the walls and filling the room with blessed warmth. Only then did Alexander turn his attention back to her, and Joyce got her first clear look at the man who had saved her life. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably somewhere in his 30s, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but it was a kind face, she decided, despite the stern set of his mouth. There was something in his expression that suggested he was not accustomed to having company, and she wondered how long it had been since another person had set foot in his cabin. He moved to a cabinet and retrieved a heavy blanket, which he wrapped around her shoulders without ceremony. Then he disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, returning a few minutes later with a steaming mug that he pressed into her hands. The liquid inside was hot and bitter, some kind of herbal tea that warmed her from the inside out. She sipped it gratefully, feeling the heat spread through her chest and down into her stomach. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice still hoarse from the cold and her ordeal. "I thought I was going to die out there." He nodded but said nothing, settling into a chair across from her and studying her with those serious dark eyes. Joyce found his silence unnerving, but she was too grateful to be alive and warm to complain about his lack of conversation. She pulled the blanket more tightly around herself and concentrated on drinking the tea, letting the warmth seep into her bones. As the immediate crisis of survival passed, Joyce became aware of her surroundings in greater detail. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with what looked like at least 2 other rooms beyond the main living area. The walls were decorated with various tools and implements, some of which she recognized and others that were completely foreign to her. There were books on a shelf near the window, more books than she would have expected to find in such a remote location. Everything spoke of a man who valued self-sufficiency and solitude, but who was not uncivilized. "I'm Joyce Clark," she said finally, feeling that some introduction was necessary. "I was traveling to Philadelphia when the storm caught me." "Alexander Richardson," he replied, his voice still rough but not unfriendly. "Philadelphia is a long way from here." "Yes," she said, and found that she did not know what else to say. How could she explain to this stranger the complicated chain of events that had brought her to his mountain, the loss and desperation that had driven her to attempt such a dangerous journey? How could she make him understand that she had nowhere else to go? Alexander seemed to sense her reluctance to elaborate, and he did not press her for details. Instead, he rose from his chair and moved to the window, peering out at the storm that continued to rage outside. Joyce could see the concern in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed as he watched the snow pile up against the glass. "This will last at least 2 days," he said, more to himself than to her. "Maybe 3. The implications of his words hit Joyce like a physical blow. 2 or 3 days trapped in this cabin with a man she did not know, dependent on his charity and goodwill for her very survival. She had no money to offer him, no way to repay his kindness except with gratitude. And after the storm passed, what then? She was still hundreds of miles from Philadelphia, still weak and alone and without resources. As if reading her thoughts, Alexander turned from the window and looked at her directly. "You're safe here," he said simply. "The storm will pass." There was something in his tone that reassured her, a quiet certainty that suggested he was a man who kept his word. But even as relief flooded through her, Joyce could not shake the feeling that her troubles were far from over. She was alive, yes, and warm and safe for the moment. But she was also completely dependent on the kindness of a stranger, and she had learned long ago that such kindness often came with a price. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the wind continued to howl. But inside the cabin, there was a strange kind of peace. Joyce finished her tea and allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. But even as she did, she could not forget that this was only a temporary reprieve. When the storm ended, she would have to face the world again, and she was no stronger now than she had been when the snow began to fall. Alexander returned to his chair and picked up a piece of leather that he had apparently been working on before he found her. His hands moved with practiced skill as he stitched, and Joyce found herself watching the rhythmic motion, hypnotized by the simple domesticity of it. Here was a man who had built a life for himself in the wilderness, who needed nothing from the outside world except perhaps the occasional supply run to town. She envied him that independence, that sense of belonging somewhere. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, partly out of curiosity and partly to break the silence that had stretched between them. 5 years, he said without looking up from his work. "Built the cabin myself." Joyce tried to imagine what it would be like to live in such isolation, to go days or weeks without seeing another human face. It seemed both terrifying and appealing, the idea of being completely self-sufficient, answerable to no one. But she was a woman, and the world did not offer women the same opportunities for independence that it offered men. Even if she had the skills and the strength to build a life in the wilderness, society would never allow her to live alone without scandal and suspicion. Checkpoint 3. The storm raged through the night with an intensity that made the cabin walls shudder. Joyce lay on the narrow cot that Alexander had prepared for her in the cabin's second room, listening to the wind howl and the snow beat against the windows like angry fists. Despite the warmth of the fire in the next room and the thick blankets Alexander had provided, she found sleep elusive. Every time she began to drift off, her mind would return to the events of the day, to the moment when her strength had finally given out and she had collapsed in the snow, certain that she was going to die. She thought about the man who had saved her, trying to understand what kind of person chose to live alone in such a remote place. Alexander Richardson was clearly educated. She had seen the books on his shelves and heard the intelligence in his voice, despite his sparse words. But there was something about him that suggested he was running from something, or perhaps running towards something that could only be found in solitude. She wondered what had driven him to this mountain, what had made him turn his back on civilization and the company of his fellow human beings. When morning came, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to have grown stronger during the night, and when Joyce peered through the small window in her room, she could see nothing but a wall of white. The snow had drifted up against the cabin walls, and she could barely make out the shapes of the trees that she knew surrounded the clearing. She dressed slowly, her muscles stiff and sore from the previous day's ordeal. Her dress was wrinkled and travel-stained, and she felt acutely aware of how she must appear to her host. She had not been able to bathe properly in days, and her hair, once her pride, hung in limp tangles around her face. She did her best to make herself presentable, but there was little she could do with the limited resources at her disposal. When she emerged from her room, she found Alexander already up and moving about the cabin with quiet efficiency. He had rebuilt the fire and was preparing what looked like a simple breakfast at the stove in the kitchen area. The smell of coffee filled the air, and Joyce's stomach growled in response. She had not eaten a proper meal in longer than she cared to remember. "Good morning," she said, hovering uncertainly in the doorway between the rooms. He looked up from his work and nodded. "Morning. Coffee's ready." He poured her a cup of the strong black liquid and handed it to her, along with a plate containing eggs, bacon, and thick slices of bread. Joyce accepted the food gratefully, though she felt awkward about taking so much when she had nothing to offer in return. She had been raised to believe that accepting charity was shameful, that a person should always pay their own way in the world. But her pride seemed like a luxury she could not afford when the alternative was starvation. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the continued howling of the wind outside. Joyce found herself stealing glances at Alexander, trying to read his expression and gauge his mood. He seemed comfortable with the quiet, but she could not tell if her presence was welcome or merely tolerated. She had imposed herself on his solitude without invitation, and she knew that some men would resent such an intrusion, no matter how unavoidable it had been. After breakfast, Alexander busied himself with various tasks around the cabin, while Joyce sat by the fire, feeling useless and in the way. She watched him repair a harness, sharpen knives, and tend to other maintenance that seemed to be part of his daily routine. His movements were economical and purposeful, and she could see that he was accustomed to taking care of everything himself. The presence of a helpless woman in his domain must be a significant disruption to his carefully ordered life. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked finally, unable to bear her own inactivity any longer. He paused in his work and looked at her consideringly. "Can you sew?" "Yes," she said, grateful for the chance to make herself useful. "I'm quite good with a needle." He disappeared into another room and returned with a basket containing several items of clothing that needed mending. There were tears in a heavy shirt, missing buttons on a coat, and a pair of trousers with a ripped seam. Joyce accepted the basket eagerly, happy to have something productive to do with her hands. As she worked, she found herself relaxing in a way she had not experienced in months. There was something soothing about the familiar rhythm of stitching, the simple satisfaction of repairing something that was broken. It reminded her of the early days of her marriage to Peter, when they had been poor but hopeful, working together to build a life from nothing. Those had been hard times, but they had also been good times, filled with love and shared purpose. The memory brought tears to her eyes, and she had to pause in her sewing to wipe them away. She thought she had done her grieving for Peter, but apparently the wound was still fresh enough to catch her off guard. She missed him with an intensity that sometimes took her breath away, missed his gentle humor and his unwavering faith that everything would work out in the end. He had been the kind of man who could find hope in the darkest circumstances, and she wondered what he would have thought of her current situation. "Your husband?" Alexander asked quietly, and Joyce realized that he had been watching her. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. She bent her head over her sewing, hoping he would not press her for details. But Alexander seemed to understand that some subjects were too painful for casual conversation, and he returned to his own work without further comment. The day passed slowly, marked only by the gradual dimming of the light outside the windows and the continued fury of the storm. Joyce finished mending the clothes in the basket and then helped Alexander prepare a simple dinner. She was surprised by how domestic the scene felt, how natural it seemed to move around the kitchen with him, anticipating his needs and working in harmony despite the fact that they were virtual strangers. As evening approached, Alexander stood at the window again, studying the storm with the same serious expression she had seen the night before. Joyce joined him, looking out at the swirling white chaos that showed no signs of diminishing. "How much longer do you think it will last?" she asked. "Hard to say," he replied. "Could be another day. Could be 3. Mountain storms are unpredictable." The thought of being trapped here for several more days filled Joyce with a mixture of anxiety and something else she could not quite identify. She was grateful for Alexander's hospitality, but she was also acutely aware of the awkwardness of her position. She was a single woman, alone with a man she barely knew, dependent on his charity for her survival. In the civilized world, such a situation would be scandalous, but here in the wilderness, the normal rules of society seemed to hold less sway. "I want you to know how grateful I am," she said, turning to face him. "You saved my life, and I have no way to repay you." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was not desire, exactly, though there was an awareness there that had not been present before. It was more like recognition, as if he was seeing her as a person rather than simply a problem to be solved. "No payment necessary," he said simply, but his voice was softer than it had been before. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the flickering light of the fire, and Joyce felt something shift between them. The careful politeness that had characterized their interactions was giving way to something more complex, more dangerous. She was a woman alone with a man who owed her nothing, who could do with her as he pleased and face no consequences. But even as the thought occurred to her, she realized that she did not fear Alexander Richardson. There was something in his manner, in the careful way he had treated her, that told her he was not the kind of man who would take advantage of her vulnerability. The moment was broken by a sound from outside, a crash that was audible even over the howling wind. Alexander immediately moved to the door, grabbing his coat and hat from their pegs. "Stay here," he said, and before Joyce could protest, he was gone, disappearing into the storm. She stood frozen by the window, watching the place where he had vanished, her heart pounding with sudden fear. What if something had happened to him? What if he was injured out there in the storm? She would be completely helpless, trapped in the cabin with no idea how to survive on her own. The thought of being left alone in this wilderness was almost more terrifying than freezing to death had been. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour, and still Alexander did not return. Joyce began to pace the small space of the cabin, her imagination conjuring increasingly dire scenarios. She thought she heard voices outside, but when she pressed her face to the window, she could see nothing but the endless white of the storm. Then the door burst open, and Alexander stumbled inside, but he was not alone. Behind him came two other figures, both men, their faces hidden by snow-covered scarves and the brims of their hats. Joyce's relief at seeing Alexander safe was immediately replaced by a new kind of fear. Who were these men, and what were they doing out in such weather? As they stamped the snow off their boots and unwrapped their faces, Joyce got her first clear look at the strangers. One was older, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered look of a man who had spent his life outdoors. The other was younger, closer to her own age, with sharp features and pale eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Both men were armed, she noticed, with pistols at their hips and rifles slung across their backs. "Found them trying to take shelter in my woodshed," Alexander explained, his voice carefully neutral. "Couldn't leave them out there to freeze." The older man stepped forward, removing his hat and nodding politely to Joyce. "Ma'am," he said. "Name's Gary Alvarez. This here's my partner, Andrew Hughes. We're much obliged for the shelter." Joyce nodded in return, but something about the men made her uneasy. There was nothing overtly threatening about their manner, but there was a hardness in their eyes that spoke of violence and danger. She found herself moving closer to Alexander, seeking the protection of his presence. "What brings you up here in weather like this?" Alexander asked, and Joyce could hear the suspicion in his voice. Gary smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. "Business," he said simply. "We were tracking someone when the storm caught us. Figured we'd wait it out and pick up the trail when it clears." "Tracking someone?" Alexander's voice had gone very quiet, and Joyce felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "A woman." Andrew spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and cultured. "She's wanted for theft. Stole a considerable sum from her employer before disappearing. We're bounty hunters, you see. Perfectly legal." Joyce felt the blood drain from her face. They were talking about her. She was certain of it. Somehow Victoria's husband had discovered that she had taken the money from their safe, the money she had needed to pay for her journey east. She had told herself it was not really stealing, that Victoria's letter had promised to welcome her home, that the money would be repaid once she reached Philadelphia. But apparently Victoria's husband did not see it that way. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but she could feel Alexander's eyes on her, and she knew that he had noticed her reaction. The two bounty hunters were looking around the cabin with professional interest, their gazes lingering on her for just a moment longer than was comfortable. "Haven't seen anyone else up here," Alexander said carefully. "Just me and the lady. She was caught in the storm same as you." Gary nodded, but Joyce could see that he was studying her face intently. "What's your name, miss?" he asked politely. Joyce's mouth went dry. If she lied, they might become suspicious. If she told the truth, they would know immediately who she was. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, becoming more dangerous with each passing second. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Joyce could feel her heart hammering in her chest as she realized that her brief respite from the world's cruelties was about to come to an abrupt and terrifying end. The silence in the cabin stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Joyce felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes upon her, each gaze carrying its own dangerous implications. Gary Alvarez waited with the patience of a predator, his weathered face betraying nothing but professional interest. Andrew Hughes stood slightly behind his partner, his pale eyes never leaving Joyce's face, as if he could read the guilt written there in invisible ink. And Alexander, dear Alexander, who had saved her life, watched her with an expression she could not decipher, though she thought she detected a flicker of understanding in his dark eyes. "I asked your name, miss," Gary repeated, his voice still polite but with an edge that had not been there before. Joyce's throat felt as dry as desert sand. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The storm still raged outside, and even if she could somehow escape the cabin, she would be dead within minutes in the howling wilderness. Her legs, still weak from her ordeal, would never carry her far enough to matter. She was trapped as surely as if she were in a cage, and the key was held by men who meant her harm. "Mary," she said finally, the lie slipping from her lips like a prayer. "Mary Thompson. Mary Thompson." Andrew Hughes tilted his head slightly, and Joyce saw something shift in his expression. It was subtle, but she caught it, and her heart sank. He knew. Somehow he knew she was lying, though he gave no outward sign of his suspicion. "Mary Thompson," Gary repeated thoughtfully. "And where might you be traveling from, Miss Thompson?" Each question felt like a step closer to a trap, but Joyce forced herself to remain calm. She had learned during her months of hardship that desperation could make a person clever in ways they never expected. "I was visiting family in Denver," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm trying to get back east to my sister in Philadelphia." "Denver's a long way south of here," Andrew observed, his cultured voice carrying just a hint of skepticism. "Seems like an odd route to take to Philadelphia." Alexander stepped forward then, and Joyce felt a surge of gratitude for his intervention. "Mountain passes can be tricky," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Easy to get turned around, especially for someone not familiar with the terrain." Gary nodded, but his eyes never left Joyce's face. She could feel him studying her, cataloging every detail of her appearance, comparing it to some mental image he carried. The stolen money had been discovered faster than she had hoped, and Victoria's husband had wasted no time in sending hunters after her. She wondered if Victoria even knew what was happening, or if her husband had kept the theft secret to avoid the scandal. "You mentioned you were tracking a thief," Alexander said, and Joyce admired the casual way he brought up the subject, as if it were merely a matter of polite conversation. "What exactly did this woman steal?" "Money," Andrew replied smoothly. "A considerable sum from her brother-in-law's safe. Family matter, really, but theft is theft regardless of the relationship." The words hit Joyce like physical blows. So Victoria did know, or at least her husband had told her some version of the truth. Joyce wondered what lies he had spun, what story he had concocted to explain her desperate act. She doubted he had mentioned the months of letters she had sent begging for help after Peter's death, letters that had gone unanswered until Victoria's sudden change of heart. "Families," Gary said with a shake of his head, as if the complications of kinship were a source of endless amazement to him. "Always the messiest cases. This woman, Joyce Clark, she disappeared from Philadelphia about 2 weeks ago. Her sister's husband hired us to bring her back." Hearing her real name spoken aloud in Alexander's cabin felt like a violation, as if these men had brought the outside world's cruelty into the one place where she had felt safe. Joyce kept her expression carefully blank, but inside she was screaming. 2 weeks! They had been hunting her for 2 weeks, following her trail across hundreds of miles of wilderness. How had they tracked her so far? How had they known which route she would take? "You boys must be good at your job," Alexander said, and there was something in his tone that made Joyce look at him sharply. "Tracking someone across this kind of country in winter, that takes skill." "We do all right," Gary replied with false modesty. "Though I'll admit, this one's been trickier than most. The woman's got more backbone than we expected. Most folks would have given up by now, found somewhere warm to hole up for the winter. Maybe she's desperate," Alexander suggested quietly. Andrew laughed. But there was no humor in the sound. "Desperate enough to steal from family, certainly. Amazing what people will do when they think they're owed something." The casual cruelty of his words made Joyce's hands clench into fists beneath the blanket Alexander had wrapped around her. These men knew nothing about her situation, nothing about the months of hunger and cold she had endured, nothing about the letters she had sent pleading for help that had gone unanswered until it was too late. They saw only a simple story of greed and betrayal, and they were content to judge her based on that incomplete picture. "Well," Gary said, stretching and looking around the cabin with obvious satisfaction, "looks like we'll be here for a while. This storm shows no signs of letting up." The prospect of spending days trapped in the cabin with these men filled Joyce with dread. How long could she maintain her deception? How long before one of them said something that would expose her lie? She caught Alexander's eye and saw her own concern reflected there. He understood the danger she was in, even if he did not know all the details. "I've got supplies enough for everyone," Alexander said, though Joyce could hear the reluctance in his voice. "But it'll be tight quarters." "We're grateful for the hospitality," Andrew said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. In weather like this, a man could freeze to death in minutes. As if to emphasize his point, the wind howled around the cabin with renewed fury, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the hot stones of the fireplace. Joyce pulled the blanket tighter around herself and tried to think of a way out of her predicament. But every option seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. She was trapped, and it was only a matter of time before these men discovered who she really was. Checkpoint 4. The evening meal was a tense affair, with conversation flowing in careful, measured exchanges that revealed nothing of importance. Gary and Andrew had settled themselves at Alexander's table as if they belonged there, their weapons within easy reach despite the apparent civility of the situation. Joyce sat as far from them as the small space allowed, picking at her food and trying to remain invisible. Alexander had prepared a simple but filling meal of venison stew and fresh bread, and Joyce was struck by the contrast between his quiet competence and the predatory alertness of the two bounty hunters. Everything about Alexander spoke of a man who had found peace in solitude, who had built a life of simple contentment in the wilderness. The presence of Gary and Andrew disrupted that peace like stones thrown into still water. "Fine cooking," Gary commented, gesturing with his spoon toward the stew. "Man gets tired of trail food after a while." "Thank you," Alexander replied simply. But Joyce could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the weapons the two men had propped against the wall near the door. "You been up here long?" Andrew asked, his tone conversational but his pale eyes sharp with interest. "Few years," Alexander said, offering no elaboration. "Lonely life," Gary observed. "Most men need company, need to hear voices besides their own." Alexander shrugged. "Some do, some don't." Joyce admired his economy with words, the way he gave away nothing of himself while remaining polite. But she could see that the bounty hunters were frustrated by his reticence, and she worried that their frustration might eventually turn dangerous. Men like these were accustomed to getting what they wanted, and they would not be put off indefinitely by Alexander's quiet refusal to cooperate. "What about you, Miss Thompson?" Andrew turned his attention to Joyce, and she felt her stomach clench with fear. "What takes you all the way to Philadelphia? Family?" "My sister," Joyce said, keeping her voice steady with an effort. "She's been ill." "Sorry to hear that," Gary said with what might have been genuine sympathy. "Family's important. Man's got to take care of his own, even when it's difficult." The irony of his words was not lost on Joyce. Her own family had abandoned her when she needed them most, casting her out for the crime of marrying for love instead of social advancement. Only Victoria's belated change of heart had offered any hope of reconciliation, and now even that hope had been poisoned by suspicion and betrayal. "Course," Andrew continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. Sometimes family can disappoint you. Sometimes, the people you trust most are the ones who hurt you worst. Joyce felt Alexander's eyes on her and knew that he was beginning to understand the true nature of her situation. She had not told him about the money, about the theft that had driven her to flee Philadelphia in the first place. But he was not a stupid man, and the bounty hunter's presence here was no coincidence. Disappointment's part of life, Alexander said quietly. People do what they think they have to do. That's a generous way of looking at it, Gary replied. Me? I think people make choices, and they got to live with the consequences of those choices. Even when the choices are between bad and worse? Alexander asked, and Joyce heard something in his voice that made her look at him sharply. Andrew laughed. There's always another choice. Might not be easy, might not be pleasant, but there's always another way. Is there? Alexander's question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Sometimes a person gets backed into a corner with no way out except through. The conversation was becoming dangerous, Joyce realized. Alexander was defending her without knowing the full truth of what she had done, and the bounty hunters were growing suspicious of his sympathy for a woman they believed to be a thief. She needed to change the subject before someone said something that could not be taken back. The storm seems to be getting worse, she said, gesturing toward the windows, where snow continued to pile up against the glass. Mountain storms are unpredictable, Gary agreed, but his eyes remained fixed on Alexander's face. Sometimes they blow through quick. Sometimes they settle in for days. This one's got staying power, Alexander said, rising to clear the dishes. Could be here through tomorrow, maybe longer. The prospect of another day trapped in the cabin with these men made Joyce's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain calm. She helped Alexander with the dishes, grateful for something to do with her hands, something to focus on besides the growing tension in the room. As she worked, she became aware that Andrew was watching her closely, his pale eyes tracking her every movement. There was something unsettling about his attention, something that went beyond professional interest. She had encountered men like him before, men who saw women as objects to be used and discarded, and she recognized the predatory gleam in his gaze. "You're very kind to help," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Not many women would be so thoughtful." Joyce forced herself to smile. "It's the least I can do." "Mr. Richardson has been very generous." "Richardson," Andrew repeated thoughtfully. "Unusual name for these parts." Alexander's hands stilled for just a moment as he dried a plate, and Joyce saw something flicker across his face. It was gone almost immediately, but she had caught it, and she wondered what secrets Alexander might be hiding in his past. "Names travel," Alexander said simply. "People move around." "They do indeed," Gary agreed. "Take our Miss Clark, for instance. Born and raised in Philadelphia, married a mining man, ended up in Colorado. People follow opportunity, follow hope, follow whatever they think will make their lives better." Each detail felt like a nail being driven into Joyce's coffin. They knew everything about her, every step of her journey from privileged daughter to desperate widow. They had probably talked to people who remembered her, people who could describe her appearance and her circumstances. How long before they connected the woman sitting in this cabin with the fugitive they were hunting? "Mining's hard work," Alexander observed. "Dangerous, too." "Very dangerous," Andrew agreed. "Miss Clark's husband died of lung disease. Black lung, they call it. Terrible way to go." Joyce bit her lip to keep from crying out. They were talking about Peter's death as if it were just another piece of information to be cataloged and used. They had no understanding of what she had lost, no comprehension of the love that had been torn from her life. To them, Peter was just a dead mining man, significant only as part of the story that had led to Joyce's desperate act. "Left his widow in difficult circumstances," Gary continued relentlessly. "No money, no family support, nowhere to turn. Enough to drive a person to desperate measures." Alexander set down the plate he had been drying and turned to face the bounty hunters directly. "Seems like you know a lot about this woman's business." "It's our job to know," Andrew replied with a shrug. "Can't track someone if you don't understand what drives them." "And what drives her?" Alexander asked quietly. Gary smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Same thing that drives most thieves. Greed. She figured her sister owed her something, So she took what she thought was hers. Maybe she was right, Alexander said, his voice so quiet it was almost lost beneath the sound of the storm. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Andrew's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his weapon, and Joyce felt her heart begin to race. Alexander was walking a dangerous line, defending a woman he barely knew against men who were armed and obviously willing to use violence. Right or wrong doesn't matter, Gary said, his voice hardening. Law's the law. She took money that didn't belong to her, and now she's got to face the consequences. Consequences, Alexander repeated thoughtfully. Interesting word. Makes it sound like justice instead of revenge. Andrew stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. You seem mighty interested in this woman's fate, Richardson. Makes a man wonder why. The cabin fell silent except for the howling of the wind outside. Joyce could feel the violence crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. These men were killers, she realized. They might call themselves bounty hunters, but they were killers all the same, and they would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Alexander faced them calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides, but Joyce could see the coiled tension in his posture. He was ready for whatever might come, and she found herself wondering what kind of man chose to live alone in the wilderness. What kind of past might drive someone to seek such complete solitude? Just making conversation, Alexander said mildly. Long night ahead of us. Gary studied him for a long moment, then gestured for Andrew to sit back down. That it is, he agreed. Long night indeed. Checkpoint. 5. Sleep was impossible. Joyce lay on the narrow cot in the small room Alexander had given her, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling around her and the continued fury of the storm outside. She could hear the murmur of voices from the main room, where the three men sat by the fire, but she could not make out their words. The tone was civil enough, but she could sense the underlying tension, the careful dance of predator and prey that was playing out just beyond her door. She thought about Peter, about the life they had tried to build together in that harsh mining town. He had been so full of hope when they first arrived, so certain that hard work and determination would be enough to secure their future. The mine had seemed prosperous then, the veins of silver running deep and true through the mountain rock. Peter had worked 12-hour shifts in the darkness below ground, coming home each night covered in dust and exhaustion but still able to smile, still able to dream of the day when they would have enough money to buy their own land, build their own house, start a family. But the mine had played out sooner than anyone expected, the silver veins pinching off to nothing just as the first signs of Peter's illness began to show. The cough that had started as a minor irritation grew worse with each passing month, until he was bringing up blood with the black dust that coated his lungs. The company doctor had been useless, more concerned with keeping the men working than with treating their ailments. By the time they realized how serious Peter's condition was, it was too late for anything but prayer. Joyce had nursed him through those final months, watching the man she loved waste away before her eyes. The strong hands that had once lifted her effortlessly became thin and fragile. The voice that had whispered sweet words in her ear grew weak and raspy. But even as his body failed him, Peter had maintained his faith that everything would work out, that God would provide a way for Joyce to survive after he was gone. Write to your sister, he had urged her during one of his lucid moments near the end. Family's family, Joyce. She'll come around. But Victoria's response to Joyce's letter announcing Peter's death had been cold and formal. A brief note expressing condolences but offering no real help. The money Joyce had requested to pay for Peter's burial and her passage back east had been refused, with Victoria explaining that her husband felt it would be inappropriate to support Joyce's unfortunate choices. The rejection had been devastating, but Joyce had found the strength to bury her husband with dignity and begin the long process of trying to rebuild her life. The months that followed had been a nightmare of poverty and desperation. Without Peter's income, Joyce could not afford to keep their small cabin, and the other mining families were struggling too hard with their own problems to offer much help. She had taken whatever work she could find, cleaning houses, taking in laundry, even working briefly in the town's only saloon, though the conditions there had quickly become intolerable. It was during those dark months that Victoria's second letter had arrived, the one that had changed everything. The tone was completely different from the first, warm and apologetic, full of regrets about the way Joyce had been treated. Victoria wrote that she had been thinking about their childhood, about the closeness they had shared before Joyce's marriage had driven a wedge between them. She begged Joyce to come home to Philadelphia, promising that all would be forgiven and that Joyce would have a place in the family again. The letter had been like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Joyce had read it over and over, hardly daring to believe that her prayers had finally been answered. But the practical problem remained. She had no money for the journey, no way to pay for stage fare and lodging across the hundreds of miles that separated her from her sister. That was when she had remembered the safe in Victoria's husband's study, the one where he kept his business funds. Joyce had seen him open it during her last visit to Philadelphia, years ago when she and Peter had first announced their engagement. The combination had been Victoria's birthday, a romantic gesture that had seemed touching at the time, but now offered a solution to Joyce's desperate situation. She had told herself it was not really stealing. Victoria's letter had promised to welcome her home, had spoken of family obligations and the duty they owed to each other. Surely Victoria would understand that Joyce had only taken what she needed, that the money would be repaid once she was safely in Philadelphia and could find work. It was a loan, nothing more, taken from family who had a moral obligation to help her in her time of need. But as Joyce lay in Alexander's cabin, listening to the bounty hunters discuss her case with casual professionalism, she realized how naive she had been. Victoria's husband had not seen the taking of his money as a family loan to be repaid. He had seen it as theft, pure and simple, and he had wasted no time in sending armed men after her to drag her back to face the consequences. The worst part was not knowing whether Victoria was complicit in her husband's actions or whether she was being kept in the dark about what was happening. Had Victoria's letter been genuine, or had it been part of some elaborate trap? Joyce could not believe that her sister, despite their differences, would be capable of such cruelty. But then again, she had not believed that Victoria would abandon her after Peter's death either. A soft knock on her door interrupted her dark thoughts. Joyce sat up in bed, her heart racing. "Come in," she whispered. Alexander slipped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. In the dim light that filtered through the small window, she could see the serious expression on his face, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of barely controlled anger. "They're asleep," he said quietly, settling into the single chair near the window. Finally, finally, "They're asleep," he said. Joyce pulled the blanket up to her chin, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. She was alone with a man she barely knew, wearing only her thin chemise, dependent on his goodwill for her very survival. But looking at Alexander's face, she felt no fear. There was something in his expression that spoke of protection rather than threat, of a man who understood what it meant to be hunted. "They know who I am," she said, the words barely audible even in the quiet room. Alexander nodded. "I figured as much. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" The simple directness of his question caught her off guard. She had expected judgment, condemnation, perhaps even anger that she had brought danger to his peaceful sanctuary. Instead, he was asking her what she wanted to do, as if her opinion mattered, as if she had some agency in determining her own fate. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't run, not in this storm. And even if I could, where would I go?" "Storm's got to break eventually," Alexander said thoughtfully. "When it does, there might be options." Joyce studied his face in the dim light, trying to understand what he was offering. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know if I'm guilty of what they say I did." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on something she could not see. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "I know what it's like to be hunted," he said simply. "I know what it's like to have your past catch up with you when you're trying to start over." The words hung between them like a bridge, connecting their separate experiences of loss and desperation. Joyce realized that Alexander was not just offering her practical help, he was offering her understanding. The recognition that sometimes good people were forced to make bad choices by circumstances beyond their control. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Same thing you did, probably. Took something that didn't belong to me because I thought I had no other choice." The admission should have frightened her. should have made her question whether she could trust this man who had confessed to being a thief. Instead, it made her feel less alone, less ashamed of her own desperate act. Here was someone who understood the weight of necessity, the way desperation could drive a person to actions they would never have considered in better circumstances. "Did you regret it?" she asked. Alexander considered the question carefully. "I regretted having to do it," he said finally, "but I never regretted surviving." The distinction was important, Joyce realized. There was a difference between regretting an action and regretting the circumstances that had made that action necessary. She had felt guilty about taking the money from Victoria's husband's safe, but she had never regretted the impulse to survive, to fight for her life when the world seemed determined to let her starve. "They'll take me back," she said, the words heavy with resignation. "They'll drag me back to Philadelphia to face trial, and Victoria's husband will make sure I'm punished to the full extent of the law." "Maybe," Alexander agreed. "Or maybe the storm will give us time to think of another way." The word "us" sent a warm feeling through Joyce's chest. She was not alone in this fight. Not anymore. Alexander was offering to stand with her, to help her find a way out of the trap that was closing around her. She did not know why he was willing to risk himself for a stranger, but she was grateful beyond words for his support. Checkpoint 6. The second day of the storm dawned gray and bitter, with no sign that the weather was improving. If anything, the wind seemed to have grown stronger during the night, howling around the cabin with a ferocity that made the walls shudder. Snow continued to pile up against the windows, and when Alexander opened the door to check the conditions outside, the wind drove a spray of ice crystals into the cabin that made everyone step back from the entrance. "Another day at least," he announced, closing the door firmly against the storm. "Maybe two." Gary and Andrew received this news with apparent equanimity, but Joyce could see the frustration in their eyes. Every day they spent trapped in the cabin was another day their quarry might slip away, another day closer to losing the trail entirely. She wondered if they suspected that she was the woman they were hunting, or if they were simply growing impatient with the delay. The morning meal was another exercise in careful conversation and watchful silence. Joyce helped Alexander prepare breakfast while the bounty hunters sat at the table, their weapons within easy reach. The domestic scene felt surreal, as if they were all playing parts in some elaborate theatrical performance where everyone knew their roles. But no one dared speak their true thoughts. "Sleep well, Miss Thompson?" Andrew asked with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "As well as can be expected," Joyce replied carefully. "The storm makes for restless nights." "Storms have a way of bringing out the truth in people," Gary observed, cutting into his eggs with deliberate precision. "Strip away all the pretense, all the careful manners, and show what's really underneath." Alexander set a plate in front of Joyce, with perhaps more force than necessary. "Some people are the same in storm or sunshine," he said quietly. "Others change with the weather." "Which are you, Richardson?" Andrew asked, his pale eyes glittering with interest. "I'm the kind who minds his own business," Alexander replied evenly. Gary laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's a luxury not everyone can afford. Some of us have responsibilities, obligations that don't disappear just because we'd rather be left alone." The conversation felt like a chess match, with each player making careful moves while trying to anticipate their opponent's strategy. Joyce found herself caught in the middle, trying to follow the subtext while maintaining her own deception. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the careful balance of the situation becoming more precarious with each passing hour. After breakfast, Alexander announced that he needed to check on his animals, the few chickens and the milk cow that he kept in a small barn behind the cabin. The storm had been hard on them, and he was concerned about their welfare. Gary and Andrew offered to help, but Alexander politely declined, saying that the animals were skittish around strangers. "I'll just be a few minutes," he said, pulling on his heavy coat and hat. "Miss Thompson, would you mind keeping an eye on the fire?" Joyce nodded, understanding that he was giving her a reason to stay inside where it was safe. But as the door closed behind Alexander, she found herself alone with the two bounty hunters, and the atmosphere in the cabin immediately grew more tense. "Interesting man, our host," Gary said, settling back in his chair and studying Joyce with open curiosity. "Knows a lot about tracking and hunting for someone who claims to keep to himself." "Mountain living requires certain skills," Joyce replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Indeed it does," Andrew agreed. "Takes a particular kind of person to choose this life, To cut themselves off from civilization so completely makes a man wonder what they're running from. The implication was clear, and Joyce felt her heart begin to race. They were probing, testing, trying to see if she would reveal something that would confirm their suspicions. She forced herself to remain calm, to give nothing away that might betray her true identity. Perhaps some people simply prefer solitude, she suggested. Perhaps, Gary said thoughtfully. Or perhaps they've done something that makes them unwelcome in polite society. The words hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Joyce could feel both men watching her closely, cataloging every reaction, every flicker of expression that might give her away. She concentrated on her breathing, on maintaining the facade of Mary Thompson, a woman traveling to Philadelphia to visit her sick sister. "You seem nervous, Miss Thompson," Andrew observed with false concern. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine," Joyce replied, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "It's just, this situation is rather unusual." "Unusual how?" Gary asked with apparent innocence. Joyce realized she had walked into a trap. Any answer she gave would reveal more about her state of mind, more about her reasons for being afraid. She cast about desperately for a response that would not incriminate her further. "Well," she said finally, "I'm not accustomed to being stranded with armed strangers. It's rather unsettling." Andrew laughed, and the sound was like broken glass. "Armed strangers? My dear Miss Thompson, we're law enforcement officers. You should feel safer with us here, not more frightened." "Of course," Joyce said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply. I'm just not used to such excitement." But she could see from their expressions that her attempt at recovery had failed. They knew she was hiding something, and they were closing in like wolves scenting wounded prey. She found herself wishing desperately for Alexander's return, for the protection of his calm presence and steady strength. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door opened and Alexander stepped back into the cabin, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice crystals from his coat. He took in the scene at a glance, noting the tension in Joyce's posture and the predatory alertness of the two bounty hunters. "Animals are fine," he announced, hanging his coat on its peg. "Storm's keeping them huddled up, but they're warm enough." "Good to hear," Gary said with false heartiness. "We were just having a pleasant chat with Miss Thompson here, getting to know each other better." Alexander's eyes met Joyce's across the room, and she saw understanding flash between them. He knew that something had happened in his absence, that the careful balance of the situation had shifted in a dangerous direction. "Miss Thompson was just telling us about her nervousness around armed strangers," Andrew added with a smile. "Perfectly understandable, of course. A woman traveling alone has to be careful." "She does indeed," Alexander agreed quietly. "Never know who you might encounter on the road these days." The double meaning in his words was not lost on anyone in the room. Gary and Andrew exchanged a look, and Joyce saw something pass between them, some silent communication that made her blood run cold. They were preparing to make their move, she realized. The game of cat and mouse was coming to an end. "Speaking of encounters," Gary said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper, "we've got a likeness of the woman we're tracking. Thought you might find it interesting." He unfolded the paper and held it up, and Joyce felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It was a sketch of her face, remarkably accurate despite being rendered in simple black lines. Someone in Philadelphia had described her to an artist, probably Victoria's husband himself, and the result was unmistakably her own features staring back at her from the paper. "Good likeness, don't you think?" Andrew asked with malicious satisfaction. Artist really captured something in the eyes, that desperate look that comes from knowing you're trapped. Joyce felt Alexander's gaze on her, but she could not bring herself to meet his eyes. The game was over, the deception exposed. There was no point in maintaining the pretense any longer. "Hello, Miss Clark," Gary said softly. "We've been looking for you." Checkpoint 7. The silence that followed Gary's words was deafening. Joyce sat frozen in her chair, the sketch of her own face seeming to mock her from across the room. All her careful lies, all her desperate attempts to maintain her disguise, had been for nothing. These men had known who she was from the moment they laid eyes on her, had been playing with her like cats with a captured mouse. "I think there's been a mistake," Alexander said quietly. but his voice carried a dangerous edge that made both bounty hunters look at him sharply. Andrew laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the warm cabin. No mistake, Richardson. That's Joyce Clark sitting right there, and we've got a legal warrant for her arrest. Warrant's only good if you can prove she's the right person, Alexander pointed out with careful logic. One woman looks much like another, especially after hard traveling. Gary pulled another paper from his pocket. This one, official looking, with seals and signatures. Got a detailed description right here. Age, height, distinguishing marks. Everything matches up perfect. Joyce found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What? Distinguishing marks. Andrew's smile was cruel as winter wind. Small scar on your left hand, shaped like a crescent moon. Got it when you were 7 years old, fell on a piece of broken glass in your father's garden. The specific detail hit Joyce like a physical blow. Only family would know about that scar, would remember the circumstances of how she had gotten it. Victoria had told them, had provided intimate details of Joyce's childhood to help these men identify her. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Your sister was very helpful, Gary said, as if reading her thoughts. Told us all about your habits, your likely routes of travel. Said you always were the stubborn one, likely to take the hard path just to prove you could. Victoria wouldn't. Joyce began, then stopped. The evidence was right there in front of her. Victoria had not only known about her husband's pursuit, she had actively helped with it. The warm, apologetic letter that had lured Joyce into stealing the money had been a lie, a trap designed to make her vulnerable. Alexander moved slightly, positioning himself between Joyce and the bounty hunters. It was a subtle shift, but everyone in the room noticed it. The protective gesture spoke volumes about where his loyalties lay. Even if she is this Joyce Clark, Alexander said carefully, that doesn't mean she's guilty of anything. Maybe there's more to the story than what's written in your papers. Story's simple enough, Andrew replied, his hand moving casually toward his weapon. Woman steals money from her brother-in-law's safe, runs away when she's caught. Not much room for interpretation there. How much money? Alexander asked. $300, Gary said with satisfaction. Enough to hang for in some states. The amount seemed to echo in the small cabin. $300 was more than most people saw in a year, enough to buy a small farm or start a business. To Joyce, desperate and starving, it had seemed like the minimum amount needed to reach Philadelphia and start over. To these men, it was a fortune worth killing for. That's a lot of money, Alexander agreed quietly. Must have been pretty desperate to risk so much. Desperation's no excuse for theft, Andrew said coldly. Law's the law, regardless of circumstances. Is it? Alexander's question was soft, but there was something in his tone that made Joyce look at him sharply. Sometimes the law serves justice, and sometimes it just serves the people with money and power. Gary's eyes narrowed. You sound like a man with experience in that area, Richardson. Got some personal knowledge of how the law works? The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Joyce could see Alexander weighing his response, calculating how much to reveal about his own past. She realized that by helping her, he was risking exposure of whatever secrets had driven him to this mountain refuge. I've seen enough to know that justice and law aren't always the same thing, Alexander said finally. Andrew stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. This is all very philosophical, but it doesn't change the facts. Miss Clark here is a thief, and we're taking her back to Philadelphia to face trial. In this storm, Alexander asked with apparent concern. That's a death sentence. She'll never survive the journey in these conditions. That's her problem, Gary said with a shrug. Should have thought about that before she decided to steal. The casual cruelty of his words made Joyce's stomach turn. These men saw her as nothing more than a commodity, a bounty to be collected regardless of the human cost. They would drag her through the storm if necessary, and if she died along the way, that was simply the price of doing business. Storm's got to break eventually, Andrew added. When it does, we'll be ready to travel. Alexander moved closer to Joyce, his presence offering what comfort it could. And if I say she's not leaving? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Both bounty hunters turned to face Alexander directly, their hands moving toward their weapons with practiced ease. Joyce felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that violence was now inevitable. That would be a mistake. Gary said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of death. "We're legal officers of the law, Richardson. Interfering with us would make you an accessory to theft, maybe worse." "Legal officers," Alexander repeated thoughtfully. "Funny thing about that, I don't see any badges, any official identification, just two armed men with some papers that could have been forged by anyone." Andrew's face flushed with anger. "You calling us liars?" "I'm saying I've got no proof you're who you claim to be," Alexander replied evenly. "For all I know, you're the thieves, looking to collect a reward by turning in an innocent woman." The accusation was brilliant in its audacity, Joyce realized. Alexander was turning their own tactics against them, using their lack of official credentials to cast doubt on their authority. It might not save her in the end, but it was buying time, forcing them to justify their actions instead of simply taking what they wanted. "We've got a warrant," Gary repeated, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Piece of paper," Alexander said dismissively. "Could have been written by anyone. Could say anything." Andrew's hand was now resting openly on the butt of his pistol. "You're walking a dangerous line, Richardson." "Am I?" Alexander's voice remained calm, but Joyce could see the tension coiled in his muscles, the readiness for violence that spoke of a man who had faced death before and survived. "Seems to me I'm just asking reasonable questions." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with both sides poised for violence, but neither quite ready to make the first move. Joyce found herself caught in the middle, the prize that would determine who lived and who died in the next few minutes. Then Andrew made his choice. His hand moved toward his gun with practiced speed, but Alexander was already in motion, diving forward and tackling the smaller man around the waist. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, rolling and struggling for control of the weapon. Gary cursed and reached for his own pistol, but Joyce was closer than he expected. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it with all her strength, catching the bounty hunter across the side of his head. He dropped like a stone, blood streaming from the gash in his scalp. The fight between Alexander and Andrew continued, both men grunting with effort as they struggled for supremacy. Andrew was smaller but vicious, fighting with the desperation of a man who knew that losing meant death. His fingernails raked across Alexander's face, leaving bloody furrows, but Alexander's superior size and strength were beginning to tell. With a final surge of effort, Alexander managed to pin Andrew's gun hand to the floor and deliver a crushing blow to his jaw. The bounty hunter went limp, unconscious, but still breathing. Alexander rolled off his opponent and struggled to his feet, breathing hard and bleeding from several wounds. He looked at Joyce, who was still holding the poker with shaking hands, and nodded his approval. "Good work," he said simply. Joyce dropped the poker and stared at the two unconscious men on the floor. "Are they dead?" Alexander knelt beside each man in turn, checking for pulses. "No, but they'll have headaches for a week. Question is, what do we do with them now?" The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, everything had changed. Joyce was no longer a helpless fugitive, and Alexander was no longer an uninvolved bystander. They were partners now, bound together by violence and the shared knowledge that there was no going back. The two unconscious bounty hunters lay sprawled on Alexander's cabin floor like broken dolls, blood seeping from their wounds into the rough wooden planks. Joyce stared at them, the iron poker still trembling in her hands, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. Minutes ago, she had been a helpless fugitive, trapped and certain of her doom. Now she stood over the men who had hunted her across hundreds of miles, and they were the ones who lay helpless. Alexander moved with swift efficiency, checking the bounty hunter's wounds and then searching through their belongings. He found rope in Gary's pack, along with additional ammunition and what looked like official correspondence. His face was grim as he read through the papers, his jaw tightening with each document he examined. "What is it?" Joyce asked, finally setting down the poker with hands that shook from the aftermath of violence. "They weren't lying about the warrant," Alexander said quietly, holding up an official-looking document bearing seals and signatures. "This is real. Your brother-in-law has legal authority to bring you back." The words hit Joyce like a physical blow. Even after everything that had happened, part of her had hoped that Gary and Andrew were simply criminals, masquerading as lawmen, that their authority was as false as everything else about this nightmare. But the papers in Alexander's hands proved otherwise. Victoria's husband had the full weight of the law behind him, and Joyce was truly a fugitive from justice. "There's more," Alexander continued, his voice growing darker. "Letters from your sister. She's been helping them track you from the beginning." He handed her a folded piece of paper, and Joyce recognized Victoria's elegant handwriting immediately. Her hands shook as she read the contents, each word cutting deeper than the last. Victoria had provided detailed descriptions of Joyce's appearance, her habits, even her likely routes of travel. The warm, apologetic letter that had lured Joyce into stealing the money had been followed by this cold, calculating correspondence designed to ensure her capture. "She knew," Joyce whispered, the paper falling from her nerveless fingers. "She knew what would happen when I took the money. The whole thing was a trap." Alexander's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "Looks that way. Question is, what do we do now?" Joyce looked at the unconscious men, then at Alexander, then at the storm still raging outside the windows. Every option seemed to lead to disaster. If they let Gary and Andrew go, the bounty hunters would simply continue their pursuit. If they kept them prisoner, they would eventually have to face the consequences of assaulting legal officers. And if they killed them, they would both become murderers, hunted by every lawman in the territory. "I don't know," she admitted, sinking into a chair by the fire. "I don't know what to do anymore." Alexander knelt beside Gary, checking the man's pulse and examining the wound on his head. The bounty hunter was breathing steadily, but blood continued to seep from the gash where Joyce had struck him with the poker. Alexander moved to Andrew next, noting the swelling around the man's jaw where his own fist had connected. "They'll live," he said finally. "But they'll be unconscious for a while yet. And then what?" Joyce asked. "When they wake up, they'll be even more determined to take me back. And now they'll want revenge for what we did to them." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying the two men with an expression Joyce could not read. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he was working through a complex problem. "Maybe not," he said slowly. "Maybe there's another way." He rose and moved to the window, peering out at the storm that continued to lash the mountainside with unrelenting fury. The snow was piling up against the glass in drifts that reached nearly to the sill, and the wind howled with a voice like all the demons of hell. "This storm's going to last at least another day," he said. "Maybe two. That gives us time to think, time to plan." "Plan what?" Joyce asked, though she was afraid to hope that there might be a solution to their predicament. Alexander turned from the window and looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious but not without warmth. "You ever think about disappearing completely? Starting over somewhere nobody knows your name or your history?" The question caught Joyce off guard. She had thought about it, of course, during the long nights of her journey when despair had seemed like her only companion. But it had always seemed like an impossible dream, something beyond the reach of a woman with no money and no skills beyond those expected of a proper lady. "Where would I go?" she asked. "How would I live?" "There are places," Alexander said quietly. "Towns in California, settlements in Oregon Territory, where nobody asks too many questions about a person's past. Places where a woman with determination could build a new life." "I have no money," Joyce pointed out. "No resources, no connections. I wouldn't last a week on my own." Alexander was quiet for a moment, and Joyce saw something flicker across his face, some internal struggle between caution and impulse. When he spoke again, his words were carefully measured. "You wouldn't have to be on your own." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Joyce stared at Alexander, trying to understand what he was offering. Was he suggesting that they flee together, that they become partners in exile? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, a leap into the unknown that would change everything about her life. "You don't know me," she said softly. "You don't know what kind of person I really am." "I know enough," Alexander replied. "I know you're brave enough to fight for your life when cornered. I know you're strong enough to survive things that would break most people. And I know you're not the kind of person who steals without good reason." His words warmed something deep inside Joyce's chest, a part of her that had been cold for so long she had forgotten it existed. Here was a man who saw her not as a criminal or a burden, but as someone worthy of respect and partnership. It was more than she had dared hope for in months of desperate flight. "What about them?" she asked, gesturing toward the unconscious bounty hunters. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the tricky part. We can't just leave them here to freeze, but we can't take them with us either. So what do we do?" Alexander moved to his pack and began pulling out supplies, his movements quick and purposeful. "We make sure they survive the storm, but we make it impossible for them to follow us immediately." Joyce watched as he sorted through rope, tools, and other equipment, beginning to understand his plan. They would leave Gary and Andrew alive but incapacitated, giving themselves a head start that might be enough to disappear completely. "They're horses," she said suddenly. "They must have horses somewhere nearby." Alexander nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. They're probably in my barn, taking shelter from the storm. Without mounts, they'll have a hard time pursuing us on foot." The plan was beginning to take shape, and Joyce felt a flutter of hope in her chest. It was dangerous, perhaps even foolhardy, but it offered something she had not had in months. A choice. Instead of being dragged back to Philadelphia to face Victoria's husband's version of justice, she could choose her own path, forge her own destiny. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you willing to risk everything to help me?" Alexander paused in his preparations and looked at her with those serious dark eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted," he said simply, "and because some things are worth the risk." The words were simple, but Joyce heard the depth of feeling behind them. Alexander was not just helping a stranger in need. He was fighting against the same forces of judgment and condemnation that had driven him to seek refuge in these mountains. In helping her, he was perhaps finding a way to redeem something in his own past. A groan from the floor interrupted their conversation. Gary was beginning to stir, his head moving slightly as consciousness started to return. Alexander immediately moved to his pack and pulled out a small bottle, uncorking it and moving toward the injured man. "What is that?" Joyce asked. "Something to keep him quiet a while longer," Alexander replied grimly. "We need more time." He knelt beside Gary and carefully poured a few drops of the liquid between the man's lips. The bounty hunter's movements stilled, and his breathing deepened into the rhythm of drugged sleep. Alexander repeated the process with Andrew, ensuring that both men would remain unconscious for several more hours. "Laudanum," he explained, seeing Joyce's questioning look. "It'll keep them under without doing permanent harm." Joyce nodded, though the casual way Alexander handled the drug suggested a familiarity with such substances that raised new questions about his past. But there was no time for curiosity now. They had work to do if they were going to escape before their captives awakened. Checkpoint 13. Alexander moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to making life-or-death decisions quickly. He began gathering supplies from around the cabin, selecting items that would be essential for survival in the wilderness, while leaving behind anything that might slow them down. Joyce watched him work, marveling at the transformation from quiet mountain hermit to decisive man of action. "Can you ride?" he asked as he stuffed dried meat and hardtack into a canvas bag. "Yes," Joyce replied, though she wondered how well after months of poor nutrition and exhaustion. "It's been a while, but I remember." "Good. We'll need to move fast once we leave here, and the terrain's rough." Alexander paused in his packing and looked at her seriously. "This won't be easy, Joyce. We'll be traveling in winter, through country that can kill you if you make a mistake. And there'll be people looking for us, not just these two." The use of her real name sent a shiver through Joyce, but it was not entirely unpleasant. After days of pretending to be Mary Thompson, it felt good to be acknowledged as herself again, even if that self was a fugitive from justice. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'd rather die free than live in chains." Alexander nodded approvingly. "Then we'd better make sure you don't have to do either." He moved to a loose floorboard near the fireplace and pried it up, revealing a hidden cache beneath. Joyce's eyes widened as he pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins, along with additional ammunition and what looked like important papers. "Emergency fund," he explained, seeing her expression. "Man living alone in the wilderness needs to be prepared for anything." The money would make their escape possible, Joyce realized. Without it, they would have been reduced to begging or stealing to survive the journey to wherever Alexander planned to take them. With it, they could buy supplies, lodging, and passage to a new life. "I'll pay you back," she said impulsively. "Somehow, someday, I'll repay every cent." Alexander looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "Joyce, if we pull this off, we'll be partners. Partners don't keep accounts with each other." The word partners sent another warm flutter through Joyce's chest. She had been alone for so long, responsible for every decision and every consequence, that the idea of sharing that burden with someone else seemed almost too good to be true. Alexander finished his packing and moved to check on their prisoners again. Both men were breathing steadily, lost in drugged sleep that would keep them unconscious for hours yet. He bound their hands and feet with rope, not tight enough to cut off circulation, but secure enough to prevent immediate escape when they awakened. "They'll be able to free themselves eventually," he explained to Joyce, "but it'll take time, and by then, we'll be long gone." "What about food and water?" Joyce asked, surprising herself with the concern in her voice. These men had hunted her like an animal, had been prepared to drag her back to face punishment for the crime of trying to survive. But she could not bring herself to wish death upon them. "I'll leave enough to keep them alive until the storm passes," Alexander replied. "After that, they'll have to make their own way back to civilization." It was more mercy than they deserved, Joyce thought, but she was glad Alexander was the kind of man who would show compassion even to his enemies. It spoke well of his character, and it made her feel more confident about trusting her life to his judgment. The storm showed no signs of abating, but Alexander seemed to think they could travel in it if they were careful. He had lived in these mountains for years, he explained, and knew every trail and shelter for miles around. The weather that would be deadly to strangers would merely be an inconvenience to someone with his knowledge and experience. "We'll head south first," he said, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table. "There's a line shack about 10 miles from here, used by hunters in the summer. We can shelter there until the worst of the storm passes, then continue toward the railroad." Joyce studied the map, noting the careful detail with which Alexander had marked every landmark and potential hazard. It was the work of a man who understood that, in the wilderness, knowledge was the difference between life and death. "How long to reach the railroad?" she asked. 4 days, maybe 5, depending on conditions. Once we're there, we can catch a train west to California. New names, new identities, new lives." The plan sounded almost too simple, but Joyce could see the careful thought that had gone into it. Alexander had clearly spent considerable time thinking about how to disappear completely, and she wondered what circumstances had made such planning necessary. "What will you tell people about me?" she asked suddenly. "If we're traveling together, people will assume we're married." Alexander's face flushed slightly, and Joyce realized she had touched on something he had been thinking about but had been reluctant to mention. "If you're comfortable with that," he said carefully, "it would be the simplest explanation. Husband and wife traveling west to start a new life. Nobody would question it." The idea of pretending to be Alexander's wife sent a complex mix of emotions through Joyce. There was fear, certainly, at the intimacy such a deception would require. But there was also something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "I suppose it makes sense," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "For practical reasons." "For practical reasons," Alexander agreed, but Joyce caught something in his tone that suggested his feelings on the matter might be more complicated than mere practicality. They spent the next hour making final preparations, gathering the supplies they would need for their journey, and ensuring that Gary and Andrew would survive their captivity. Alexander wrote a brief note explaining that the bounty hunters would find food and water in the cabin, along with instructions for freeing themselves once they awakened. It was more consideration than most men would have shown to their captors, but Joyce was beginning to understand that Alexander Richardson was not like most men. As they prepared to leave, Joyce took one last look around the cabin that had been her sanctuary for the past few days. The warm, comfortable space had represented safety and human kindness when she had needed them most. Now she was leaving it behind, stepping once again into an uncertain future. But this time, she would not be alone. Alexander shouldered his pack and moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "You ready for this?" Joyce thought about everything she was leaving behind, her old life, her family, even her name. She thought about the risks they were taking, the dangers that lay ahead, the possibility that they might not survive the journey they were about to undertake. But she also thought about the alternative, being dragged back to Philadelphia in chains, facing trial and imprisonment, becoming a cautionary tale about women who dared to step outside the boundaries society had set for them. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready." Alexander smiled, and Joyce saw something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. It was not just determination or resolve, but something warmer, more personal. He was not just helping a stranger escape justice, he was choosing to share his life with someone he cared about. "Then let's go," he said, opening the door to face the storm. The wind hit them like a physical force, driving snow and ice into their faces with stinging intensity. Joyce pulled her hood up and followed Alexander into the howling darkness, leaving behind the warm safety of the cabin for the uncertain promise of freedom. Behind them, Gary and Andrew slept on, unaware that their quarry was slipping away into the night. By the time they awakened, Joyce Clark would be gone forever, transformed into someone new, someone free. The storm swallowed them within minutes, but Joyce felt no fear. Alexander's steady presence beside her was an anchor in the chaos, and for the first time in months, she felt truly alive. Checkpoint 14. The journey through the storm was a nightmare of cold and confusion, but Alexander moved through the howling darkness with the confidence of a man who knew every rock and tree on the mountainside. Joyce followed in his footsteps, trusting his knowledge to guide them safely through terrain that would have been treacherous even in good weather. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind drove ice crystals into their faces with the force of tiny needles. But they pressed on through the night. Alexander had fashioned a rope between them before they left the cabin, ensuring that they would not become separated in the whiteout conditions. Joyce was grateful for the connection, both physical and symbolic. The rope represented their partnership, their mutual dependence, their shared commitment to reaching safety together. The line shack Alexander had marked on his map turned out to be a crude but sturdy structure built into the side of a rocky outcropping. It was barely large enough for two people, with a small stone fireplace and a pile of dry wood left by previous occupants. But after hours of fighting through the storm, it seemed like a palace to Joyce. Alexander quickly built a fire while Joyce collapsed onto the single rough bunk, exhausted by the effort of walking through deep snow in the bitter cold. Her legs ached, her lungs burned from breathing the frigid air, and her hands were so numb she could barely feel her fingers. But they had made it to the first waypoint in their escape, and that felt like a victory worth celebrating. "How much further to the railroad?" she asked when she had caught her breath enough to speak. "About 30 miles," Alexander replied, feeding wood to the growing fire. "But we'll take it in stages. There are other shelters along the way, places where we can rest and warm up." Joyce nodded, though the distance seemed almost impossibly far given her current state of exhaustion. She wondered if she had the strength to complete such a journey, especially if the weather remained as brutal as it had been during their night trek. As if reading her thoughts, Alexander moved to sit beside her on the narrow bunk. "You did well tonight," he said quietly. "A lot of people wouldn't have been able to keep up in those conditions." His praise warmed Joyce more than the fire ever could. She had spent so many months feeling weak and helpless, dependent on the charity of others for her very survival. To hear that she had shown strength and endurance was a balm to her wounded spirit. "I had good motivation," she replied, managing a tired smile. Alexander returned the smile, and Joyce felt something shift between them in the intimate confines of the small shelter. They were alone together in the wilderness, bound by shared danger and mutual trust. The pretense of being strangers helping each other had given way to something deeper, more personal. "Tell me about your life before," Joyce said softly. "What brought you to the mountains?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might provide answers to difficult questions. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "I was a different person then," he said. "Had a different name. A different life. I was a banker in Denver, married to a woman named Janet Nelson. We had a good life, or so I thought." Joyce waited patiently for him to continue, sensing that this was a story he had never told anyone before. "There was a robbery," Alexander continued. "Armed men came into the bank one day and demanded money from the vault. I was supposed to protect the bank's assets, supposed to be brave and heroable. Instead, I gave them everything they asked for without a fight." "That sounds like the sensible thing to do," Joyce said gently. "Better to lose money than lives." Alexander shook his head. The bank's board of directors didn't see it that way. Neither did my wife. They said I was a coward, that a real man would have fought to protect what was entrusted to him. I was dismissed from my position, and Janet left me for another man. Joyce felt a surge of anger on Alexander's behalf. They were wrong, she said firmly. You saved lives by not fighting. That takes courage, not cowardice. Mine, maybe, Alexander said with a bitter smile. But it doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what everyone else thought. I became a pariah in Denver, unable to find work, unable to show my face in public without people whispering about the coward banker who let himself be robbed. So, you came to the mountains? I came to the mountains, Alexander confirmed. Changed my name, built a new life where nobody knew my history or my shame. I thought I could forget what I had been, become someone different. Joyce understood now why Alexander had been so willing to help her, why he had risked everything to aid her escape. They were both refugees from judgment, both victims of a society that demanded impossible standards of behavior and punished anyone who failed to meet them. What was your real name? She asked softly. Alexander hesitated, then looked directly into her eyes. Alexander Mendoza, he said. I was born in New Mexico Territory, but I moved to Colorado when I was young. Thought I could make something of myself in the banking business. The revelation created a new intimacy between them. Alexander had shared his deepest secret, his greatest shame, trusting her with the knowledge that could destroy the new life he had built. Joyce felt the weight of that trust and the responsibility that came with it. I won't tell anyone, she promised. Your secret is safe with me. I know, Alexander replied simply. Just as yours is safe with me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn and listening to the storm rage outside their small shelter. Joyce found herself studying Alexander's profile in the flickering light, noting the strength in his jaw, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the gentleness in his hands as he tended the fire. What will we call ourselves? She asked eventually. When we reach California, what names will we use? Alexander considered the question carefully. Something simple, he said. Common names that won't attract attention. Maybe John and Mary Wilson, or Robert and Sarah Thompson. I like Sarah, Joyce said, testing the name on her tongue. Sarah Thompson has a nice sound to it. Then Sarah Thompson it is, Alexander agreed with a smile. And I'll be Robert Thompson, your devoted husband. The word husband hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. But Joyce felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation or perhaps hope. The storm continued through the next day, forcing them to remain in the cramped shelter longer than they had planned. But Joyce found that she did not mind the delay. The intimate space forced them to talk, to share stories and memories, to learn about each other in ways that would have taken weeks under normal circumstances. Alexander told her about his childhood in New Mexico, about the father who had taught him to read and write despite their poverty, about the dreams that had driven him to seek success in the business world. Joyce shared her own memories of growing up in Philadelphia, of the sister who had once been her closest friend, of the husband who had loved her enough to defy social convention. Do you miss him? Alexander asked gently. Your husband, I mean. Joyce considered the question carefully. I miss what we had together, she said finally. The companionship, the shared dreams, the feeling of being loved for who I really was. But Peter is gone, and I can't live my life mourning what I've lost. That's wise, Alexander said. I spent too many years angry about what happened to me in Denver. It took coming to the mountains to realize that anger was just another kind of prison. As the second day in the shelter drew to a close, the wind finally began to die down. Alexander ventured outside and reported that while snow was still falling, the worst of the storm seemed to be passing. They could resume their journey in the morning. That night, as they prepared to sleep in the narrow bunk, Joyce felt acutely aware of Alexander's presence beside her. The shelter was so small that they had no choice but to share the single bed, lying side by side under the heavy blankets Alexander had brought from his cabin. Sarah, Alexander said softly in the darkness, using her new name for the first time. Yes, Robert, she replied, finding that the name came naturally to her lips. Whatever happens from here on, I want you to know that helping you has been the most worthwhile thing I've done in years. You've given me a purpose again, a reason to care about something beyond my own survival. Joyce felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. You saved my life, she whispered. In more ways than one. Alexander's hand found hers under the blankets, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both comforting and intimate. Joyce felt her heart racing at the contact, but she did not pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently, letting him know that his touch was welcome. They lay like that for a long time, hands clasped in the darkness, listening to each other breathe and feeling the warmth of human connection that had been absent from both their lives for too long. Joyce found herself imagining what it might be like to truly be Alexander's wife, to share not just danger and hardship, but also joy and companionship and love. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the blankets. For the first time since Peter's death, she was allowing herself to hope for happiness, to believe that her life might hold more than mere survival. Checkpoint 15. The third day dawned clear and cold, with the storm finally spent and the sun breaking through the clouds to cast diamond sparkles across the fresh snow. Alexander woke before Joyce and quietly built up the fire, then prepared a simple breakfast of dried meat and hardtack softened in melted snow water. The humble meal tasted like a feast to Joyce, who had grown accustomed to going hungry during her months of desperate flight. As they prepared to leave the shelter, Alexander studied Joyce's face with concern. The past few days had taken their toll on her, and he could see the exhaustion in the dark circles under her eyes, the pallor of her skin that spoke of too little food and too much stress. Are you sure you're strong enough for this? He asked gently. We could wait another day, let you rest more. Joyce shook her head firmly. Every day we delay is another day for those bounty hunters to recover and pick up our trail. I can make it. Mine. Alexander nodded, though Joyce could see he was not entirely convinced, but he helped her shoulder her pack and checked to make sure she was warmly dressed before they ventured out into the brilliant morning. The journey was easier in daylight, with the storm past and the sun providing both light and a small amount of warmth. But the snow was deep, and Joyce found herself struggling to keep up with Alexander's steady pace. Her legs, still weak from months of poor nutrition, began to ache after the first hour of walking. Alexander noticed her difficulty and immediately slowed his pace, offering to carry her pack in addition to his own. Joyce wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence and prove that she could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. But practicality won out over pride, and she gratefully accepted his help. Tell me about California, she said as they walked, partly out of curiosity and partly to distract herself from the burning in her legs and lungs. It's different from here, Alexander replied, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Warmer, greener in some places. There are towns springing up everywhere, full of people looking to start over. A man and woman could disappear there, build a new life without anyone asking too many questions about their past. What kind of work could we find? Joyce asked, unconsciously using the word we that made Alexander smile. I know banking and numbers, he said. There are always businesses that need someone to keep their books, and you could teach, maybe, or work in a shop, or if we saved enough money, we could start our own business. The idea of working alongside Alexander, building something together, filled Joyce with a sense of possibility she had not felt in years. It would not be the life she had originally planned, but it might be something even better, a life chosen freely, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. They reached the second shelter on Alexander's map by mid-afternoon, a more substantial structure that had obviously been used by hunters and trappers over the years. There were supplies cached there, including additional food and warm clothing that previous travelers had left for those who might come after them. It was a reminder that even in the harsh wilderness, there were people who looked out for each other, who understood that survival sometimes depended on the kindness of strangers. We'll rest here for a few hours, Alexander decided, noting Joyce's obvious exhaustion. Get some food in you and let you recover your strength. Joyce was too tired to argue. She collapsed onto a pile of furs near the fireplace and watched Alexander efficiently build a fire and prepare a more substantial meal than they had been able to manage during their flight. The warmth and food worked their magic, and Joyce felt her strength slowly returning. How much further? She asked when she felt able to speak coherently again. About 15 miles to the railroad, Alexander replied. We can make it tomorrow if you're up to it. Joyce nodded, though privately she wondered if her body would cooperate with her determination. The journey was taking more out of her than she had expected, and she was beginning to understand just how weakened she had become during her months of hardship. As if reading her thoughts, Alexander moved to sit beside her on the pile of furs. "Joyce," he said gently, "you don't have to prove anything to me. If you need to rest, if you need help, just say so. We're partners now, remember? Partners help each other." The kindness in his voice nearly brought tears to Joyce's eyes. She had grown so accustomed to having to be strong, to never showing weakness or vulnerability, that the offer of unconditional support felt almost foreign. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Not of the journey, not of the physical hardships. I'm scared of what comes after. What if we can't make it work in California? What if people discover who we really are? What if I'm not strong enough to build a new life from nothing?" Alexander took her hand in both of his calloused palms warm against her cold fingers. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. "That's what partners do. They face whatever comes, good or bad, and they don't face it alone." Joyce looked into his dark eyes and saw something there that made her heart skip a beat. It was not just kindness or compassion, though both were present. It was something deeper, more personal, something that spoke of feelings that went beyond mere partnership or friendship. "Alexander," she began, then stopped, not sure how to put her thoughts into words. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing at the same time. They were still fugitives, fleeing for their lives, still facing an uncertain future in an unknown place. But now they were facing it together, bound by something more than circumstance or necessity. Alexander leaned closer, and Joyce felt her breath catch as she realized he was going to kiss her. Part of her wanted to pull away, to maintain the careful boundaries they had established. But a larger part of her wanted nothing more than to feel connected to another human being, to experience the warmth and comfort of being truly cared for. His lips touched hers gently, tentatively, giving her the chance to refuse if she chose. But Joyce found herself responding instead, her hand coming up to touch his face as she kissed him back. It was soft and sweet and full of promise, a sealing of the bond that had been growing between them since the moment he had carried her out of the storm. When they finally broke apart, Joyce saw her own wonder reflected in Alexander's eyes. Neither of them had expected this, had planned for their partnership to become something deeper, but it felt right, as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the sunrise. "Sarah Thompson," Alexander said softly, using her new name like a caress. "Robert Thompson," Joyce replied with a smile that felt like the first genuine expression of happiness she had worn in months. They spent the evening talking quietly by the fire, sharing dreams and fears, making plans for their new life together. It was not a romantic courtship in any traditional sense, but it was something deeper. Two souls, recognizing their kinship, two hearts choosing to beat in harmony. When it came time to sleep, they lay together on the pile of furs without awkwardness or hesitation. Joyce curled against Alexander's side, feeling safer and more content than she had in years. His arms around her were a promise of protection, of partnership, of a future built on mutual love and respect. "Tomorrow we reach the railroad," Alexander murmured into her hair. "Tomorrow we start our new life," Joyce replied, and for the first time in months, the future seemed bright with possibility. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the trees, but inside their shelter, two hearts beat as one, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Checkpoint 16. The final day of their journey to the railroad dawned crisp and clear, with the sun painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. Joyce woke in Alexander's arms, feeling more rested than she had in weeks, her body finally beginning to recover from the ordeal of their escape. The warmth of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the security of knowing she was no longer alone in her struggles, all combined to give her a sense of peace she had thought lost forever. Alexander was already awake when she stirred, his dark eyes watching her face with an expression of such tenderness that it made her heart flutter. "Good morning, Sarah," he said softly, using her new name like a gentle caress. "Good morning, Robert," she replied, marveling at how natural the words felt on her lips. It was as if Joyce Clark truly had ceased to exist, replaced by this new woman who was loved and protected and valued for who she was, rather than condemned for what she had done. They shared a simple breakfast and prepared for the final leg of their journey, both aware that this day would determine whether their desperate gamble had succeeded or failed. If they could reach the railroad without being caught, if they could board a train heading west without arousing suspicion, then they would truly be free to start over. The terrain was easier than it had been in previous days, following an old hunting trail that wound down from the mountains toward the valley where the railroad ran. But Joyce could feel the weight of their shared future pressing down on them both. The knowledge that everything they had risked and sacrificed would be meaningless if they were captured now. "What if Gary and Andrew are already there?" she asked as they walked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since they left the shelter. "They won't be," Alexander replied with more confidence than Joyce felt. "Even if they woke up immediately after we left, even if they managed to free themselves quickly, they'd still be at least a day behind us. And that's assuming they could track us through the storm, which would be nearly impossible even for experienced hunters." Joyce nodded, trying to draw comfort from his reasoning. But she could not shake the feeling that their pursuers were closer than Alexander believed, that Gary and Andrew were the kind of men who would not give up easily or be deterred by mere obstacles. As they descended toward the valley, Joyce began to hear a sound that made her heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. The distant whistle of a train. The railroad was close, perhaps only a few miles away. Soon they would know whether their escape had succeeded or whether they were walking into a trap. The trail emerged from the forest onto a ridge that overlooked the valley, and Joyce got her first clear view of their destination. The railroad cut through the landscape like a dark ribbon, with a small station building and water tower marking the spot where trains stopped to take on fuel and passengers. Smoke was rising from the station's chimney, indicating that it was occupied, and Joyce could see several horses tied up outside. "Looks busy," Alexander observed, studying the scene through a small spyglass he had produced from his pack. "Is that good or bad?" Joyce asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Hard to say. More people means more confusion, more chance to blend in, but it also means more eyes watching, more chance of being recognized." Alexander continued to study the station through his spyglass, his expression growing more concerned with each passing minute. Finally, he lowered the instrument and turned to Joyce with a grim expression. "There are two men down there who don't look like ordinary travelers," he said quietly. "They're watching the station too carefully, paying too much attention to everyone who comes and goes." Joyce felt her heart sink. More bounty hunters? Probably. Gary and Andrew must have sent word ahead, arranged for backup in case we tried to escape by rail. The realization that their escape route was compromised hit Joyce like a physical blow. They had come so far, risked so much, only to find their path blocked at the final moment. The despair that washed over her was almost overwhelming. But Alexander was already thinking ahead, his mind working through alternatives with the calm efficiency that had kept them alive this long. "There's another way," he said after a moment. "It's more dangerous. But it might be our only choice." "Ja." "What do you mean?" Joyce asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Alexander pointed to a spot further down the valley where the railroad curved around a steep hillside. "Trains have to slow down there to make the turn. If we time it right, we might be able to jump aboard a freight car while the train is moving." The idea terrified Joyce, but she could see the logic in it. If they could avoid the station entirely, they could escape without being seen by whoever was watching for them. But the risks were enormous. If they mistimed their jump, if they missed their grip on the moving train, they could be killed or seriously injured. "Have you ever done anything like that before?" she asked. Alexander shook his head. "No, but I've seen it done. Hobos and drifters do it all the time. And how many of them get killed trying?" "Some," Alexander admitted. "But staying here means certain capture. At least this way we have a chance." Joyce studied the railroad curve through Alexander's spyglass, trying to gauge the distance and timing involved. The train would be moving slowly, but it would still be dangerous. One mistake could end everything they had worked for. "When will the next train come through?" she asked. Alexander consulted a timetable he had memorized from his previous trips to town. "Should be one heading west around noon. That gives us a couple of hours to get into position." Joyce looked at the sun, calculating how much time they had left. It was already mid-morning, and they would need every minute to reach the curve and prepare for their desperate gambit. "All right," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Let's do it." Alexander smiled at her with obvious admiration. "You're braver than you know, Sarah Thompson." "I have good motivation," Joyce replied, echoing the words she had spoken in the line shack. "And a good partner." They made their way carefully down the hillside, staying in the cover of the trees and avoiding any vantage points where they might be spotted from the station. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks and hidden roots that threatened to send them tumbling down the slope, but they managed to reach their destination without incident. The spot Alexander had chosen was perfect for their purposes. The railroad curved sharply around a rocky outcropping, forcing trains to reduce speed significantly. There was good cover in the trees, and a clear path down to the tracks that would allow them to time their approach carefully. They settled in to wait, both lost in their own thoughts as the minutes ticked by. Joyce found herself thinking about the life she was leaving behind, the woman she had been before desperation had driven her to theft and flight. Joyce Clark had been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's wife. She had been raised to be a proper lady, to marry well and raise children, and never question the boundaries society had set for her. But Sarah Thompson would be different. Sarah Thompson would be a woman who had chosen her own path, who had fought for her freedom and won it. She would be a partner to a man who valued her strength and intelligence, not just her ability to conform to social expectations. The sound of the approaching train reached them long before they could see it, a distant rumble that grew steadily louder as the locomotive made its way through the valley. Joyce felt her heart begin to race as she realized that in a few minutes, everything would be decided one way or another. "Remember," Alexander said quietly, "wait for my signal. We need to time this perfectly." Joyce nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. She watched as the train came into view around the distant curve, a massive black beast belching smoke and steam as it approached their position. The locomotive was indeed slowing as it navigated the sharp turn, but it was still moving faster than Joyce had expected. The freight cars behind it swayed and rattled as they followed the curve, and she could see the challenge they faced in trying to grab onto one of them. "Now," Alexander said, and they broke from their hiding place, running down the slope toward the moving train. Joyce had never run so hard in her life, her legs pumping as she tried to match the speed of the freight cars rolling past. Alexander was beside her, his longer stride keeping pace easily, his hand reaching out toward the ladder on the side of a boxcar. His fingers caught the metal rungs, and for a moment Joyce thought he might be pulled off his feet by the train's momentum. But he held on, swinging himself up onto the ladder with athletic grace. "Come on!" he shouted over the noise of the train, reaching down toward her with his free hand. Joyce pushed herself to run even faster, her lungs burning with the effort. The train was beginning to pick up speed again as it completed the curve, and she knew she had only seconds to make her jump or be left behind. Alexander's hand closed around her wrist just as her strength gave out, hauling her up onto the ladder with a strength that seemed impossible. For a terrifying moment, she dangled in the air, her feet scrambling for purchase on the metal rungs, before she managed to get a solid grip and pull herself up beside him. They clung to the side of the freight car as the train gathered speed, both breathing hard from their desperate sprint. But they had done it. They were aboard and heading west, leaving their pursuers far behind. "We made it," Joyce gasped, hardly able to believe their success. "We made it," Alexander agreed, his arm tightening around her as they rode the rails toward their new life. Behind them, the mountains grew smaller and smaller until they were just a distant memory. Ahead lay California and the promise of freedom, of new identities and new possibilities. Joyce Clark was dead, left behind on a mountain pass where she had nearly frozen to death. In her place was Sarah Thompson, a woman who had chosen love over safety, freedom over security, hope over despair. The train carried them west through the afternoon, each mile taking them further from their past and closer to their future. And as the sun began to set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Joyce knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as a victim or a fugitive, but as a woman who had claimed her own destiny. She was free. They both were free. And that freedom was worth every risk they had taken to win it. The train whistled as it rolled through the gathering dusk, carrying two souls toward a new dawn, toward a love that had been forged in hardship and tested by fire, toward a future that belonged to them alone. In the distance, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one a promise of possibilities yet to be discovered, of dreams yet to be fulfilled, of a life yet to be lived. Sarah Thompson smiled and leaned against her husband's shoulder, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.